All views expressed on the Vecinos podcast by the guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent and does not represent the opinions of any entity or the opinions of AMC Networks, Thomson, Reuters, the companies affiliated, or within the Vecinos Collective. Vecinos brings together a vibrant and diverse community of Latinx employee resource groups committed to fostering an environment of inclusion, visibility, and professional development through collaboration, networking, and mentoring for its members and the Latinx community at large. Today's discussion, the tipping scale, the Latinx impact of the 2020 U.S. election.
It is my pleasure to introduce the fabulous Latinas who I'll be having this important, timely conversation with on the 2020 election. First, we have Brianna Carmen, who is the Director of Organizing and Partnerships for Voto Latino Foundation. At the age of 21, this all-star became one of the youngest Latinas in the nation to manage a successful U.S. congressional race. She is passionate about connecting voters with opportunities that raise their voice, which led her to the Voto Latino Foundation, where she gets to do just that. Next, we have Mariana Atencio. She is a Peabody Award-winning journalist, author, and motivational speaker. Her TEDx talk, What Makes You Special, has been viewed almost 14 million times and translated into 13 languages. Amazing. She was also recently included in the award-winning HBO series Habla. Mariana is also the co-founder of Go Like, a multimedia production company. We also have Cynthia Lopez with us. She is the executive director of New York Women in Film and Television. Her awards include 11 news and documentary Emmy Awards, which you can see behind her, a special Emmy Award for excellence in documentary filmmaking, 3 Peabody Awards, and 2 DuPont Columbia Awards. Wow, you are a force. All of you are. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you. This is a historic election. We're in the middle of a pandemic that has disproportionately affected Latinos, and this November will play a big role in determining who wins the White House. A record 32 million Latinos will be eligible to vote in November, making them for the first time the largest non-white voting bloc in the country. That's huge. So I wanted to start off by asking each of you, what does this historic shift mean for the 2020 election? I'll start off with you, Brianna.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. This historic election is so exciting because for decades, since George Bush was running back in the 2000s, they've been talking about the sleeping giant, the Latino community that would one day wake up and, really engage full force and mean the deciding factor in elections. And this year, that's us. We totaled 32 million strong. We're the second largest block of eligible voters this election. And it's monumental, not even in the key states that are, the buzz of the election, Texas, Arizona, Florida, but other states that you don't traditionally consider to be Latinx, like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And Politico, just a couple days ago, in the middle of September, they released a story saying that all paths to the White House, to 270 electoral college votes, go through the Latinx community. So it's really exciting this year.
And you, Mariana?
I echo what Brianna just said. We are the change agent in American politics, the young Latinx vote. I myself registered to vote for the first time in the United States on September 3rd. And coming here to the United States as an immigrant from Venezuela, I took 3 all Latinx women to come and register with me, because it's not just about you, it's about who you can bring along, who you can encourage. I am, as a journalist that has been covering presidential elections since 2008, I'm fed up with waiting for political parties to come knock on our doors. I'm fed up with politicians calling us, as Brianna said, the sleeping giant. The sleeping giant is woke, we're here, and we're not gonna wait for somebody to come encourage us. We are gonna be those phone calls that are gonna be the last minute decision makers in this elections, the last minute text. We have to encourage our own community and not wait for others to come understand all of the nuances and the beautiful diversity that the Latinx community is comprised of.
Yes, that's so true. And for you, Cynthia, what does this big shift mean for the election and for you as a Latina?
So I am honored to be on this panel with Brianna and Mariana. And I concur with so much of what they've said. I remember years ago, there was an article, it was a cover story that was done by Time magazine, and it was called The Browning of America. And it was basically referring to that in the year 2020, quote unquote, there would be more Latinos participating in elections and therefore would have a great impact on how government was, the role of government and basically how elections would take place in this country. So to see us go from an article like that, which really not only downplayed what was possible, but kind of really underscored that it was a negative thing, quote unquote, the browning of America. I have to say, it gives me great pleasure to be on a panel like this and see that there are Latinos and Latinas in this country, and we will show up in droves. I do believe that. And we will take the precautions necessary to have our votes counted.
You're right. This milestone means so much. And as Mariana said earlier, this is being driven by youth that are coming of age. Brianna, what would you say? What are these voters like? What issues are going to drive them to the polls?
So these voters are overwhelmingly young. When we look at the Latinx community, they sit around the age of 30. A lot of these folks are new voters, they're first-time voters, and they tend to lean more Democrat or more liberal. They're focused on things like, healthcare for all, on things like affordable education, being able to have a successful, opportunity or a job that pays the bills and helps them support their families. So we see a lot of individuals really focusing on that for this election, and those issues mean the difference between winning and losing this year.
And Mariana, you've been on the campaign trail before. What does it take for candidates to win these young voters' vote at the end of the day?
The first thing is not to take the votes for granted. I've sat in newsrooms just across the board, and nobody talks about the Latino voter, like nobody talks about where we are until it's something like October, and everyone's like, will the sleeping giant wake up? Like, are they voting? Are they not voting? Like, just don't take our vote for granted. Do the legwork early on, like invest in our communities and reaching out. I've been in Iowa in the dead of winter covering the caucuses and looking at Latino neighborhoods, because there are Latinos in Iowa, there are Latinos everywhere, and just like looking at no one knocking on doors. And Latinos, especially immigrants like I am, they're like, caucus? What? You need to inform the community about all of these processes, because it's not just showing up on election day to vote. This year, more than I guess any other year, you need to plan your vote. So what I've seen is political parties taking our votes for granted, politicians thinking that if they just pander, or they speak a little Spanish here and there, or they come to Miami where I am and they throw around a word like socialism or communism, then the community is going to vote one way or the other. And I think what Brianna pointed to and what Cynthia pointed to is a community that is American, that cares about much more than labels and stereotypes, and cares about real issues like immigration, but also beyond immigration, like education, like healthcare, all of these things, the environment, hugely important for us. So don't think that we're a homogenous group. That's what many politicians tend to think. And also don't take, again, our vote for granted.
I completely agree. And Cynthia, would you say that the way candidates approach the Latino vote has changed just in your lifetime? I mean, you referenced that cover story and how different that would never be published these days. How would you say that their approach, or candidates' approach to reaching out to Latinos, has changed in the time.
In the last 20 years.
Yeah, in the decades past.
Well, I think this goes back to what Mariana is talking about. I think that there is this assumption that just because you try to translate your opening remarks into Spanish, that that's enough to get, very discerning voters to vote for you. Or, I saw one politician, I was appalled by it. They were giving out during their sort of plea to understand their candidacy, they were giving out tacos, right? And so they didn't know who I was and what I did. And they approached me and they were like, do you want a taco? Such and such, Congresswoman is giving free tacos today. And I said, no, I would much prefer to understand what her stance is on the environment and on healthcare. And what is she going to do that a huge percentage of the Latino population has been hit by COVID? If she can answer that question, that's the question I want answered. I don't need a taco today. And people around me started laughing, but I was dead serious. I think that just translating materials into Spanish is not enough. You have to be clear about what you stand for and what you want to change. We understand that in this country, we have various social issues that we have to tackle with. And so I want to understand, I know that each of the candidates can't change everything, but what do you stand for? And how are you going to help the Latino family progress? Those are the questions I want answered.
Of course. And, you touched on something that's very important. We know that voters vote on what affects them. And we know that the coronavirus pandemic has disproportionately affected Latino communities, whether you're looking at it from a health standpoint or from an economic standpoint. Brianna, how important is this issue? What do the polls tell us in terms of how important this issue is for Latinos?
We saw through a Pew Research report earlier this year that 6 in 10 Latino households were negatively affected by coronavirus. And that means, they knew someone, either themselves, a family member, or someone directly connected to them who lost a job or suffered, from less wages after COVID. And Latino women were even more so impacted. So we're really expecting that to have, such a huge impact on the election. When people look at elections, usually when it's an incumbent, they tend to see how the economy is doing. And that's a good indicator of, whether or not that incumbent will be successful in that following election. So it's really interesting to see we are embarking on a recession. Economics do not look good, especially for this community. We also see that the Latinx community is feeling dissatisfied. They're feeling as dissatisfied this year as they were in 2010, feeling the reverberations of the last recession. So it's going to be a very interesting election year, considering the economy and the Latinx voter.
And Cynthia, you were talking about earlier living in Jackson Heights in New York, an area that was hit hard by the pandemic. What are you seeing or feeling in your community when it comes to this topic?
I believe, so just to contextualize for your listeners who don't know the different neighborhoods in New York, Jackson Heights is, just a few blocks from Elmhurst. So I live a couple of blocks from Elmhurst Hospital, which was considered to be sort of pandemic central. The level, at the height of the pandemic, it was my first time ever where I saw a mobile morgue in the United States. I've traveled extensively, but I've never seen a mobile morgue in the United States, let alone in my community. What this community has faced over the last several months has been ultimately devastating. But at the same token, I have to say the Latino community is about resilience and thriving in spite of extraordinary circumstances. And so now we need to see as Brianna was saying. In the fall, we're faced with a financial crisis like never before, worse than in our history, the United States history. So we're really looking for candidates that are going to really look holistically at healthcare and how we can provide healthcare for all, not just a few who can afford it. We really are in this community looking for people who will think of creative ways to engage Latinos in employment practices and in industries that will be developed, right? Because we need to understand that coronavirus has impacted our labor the way we know it, and we need to come up with creative ideas of employing people throughout the crisis, right? Because to me, the crisis, it's not that it happens and it went away. This crisis is a 2-year crisis. You know what I mean? It's not, it's going to take us a very long time to dig out of this. So I think when you ask the question of what we look for in candidates, I think creative solutions, I think understanding that not all Latinos are immigrants. That's like, I cannot tell you. Every day I feel like I have to give an education to someone who thinks that I'm from someplace else because my last name is Lopez. So candidates that are very discerning about the needs that we have as a society and that Latinos are part of that society. And again, that it's not just about having 2 languages on a brochure, but really coming up with innovative ways to deal with employment, healthcare, and education for our young people.
And Mariana, how have you seen the pandemic, or how do you see the pandemic sort of playing out in voters' minds as they head to the polls, whether they're young or old? How do you see that affecting Latino voters?
The pandemic is, I think it's sort of this cloud that it will hang over this election, you know, almost like regardless of the other issues. And I think that'll play out very differently state by state on how just it affected the different communities. I know that here in the state of Florida, it hit us pretty hard. And, you know, there's a debate whether or not the measures that we're taking were the correct ones regarding small business owners, or whether there should have been a mask mandate, et cetera. What I do know is that, especially here in Florida, it is very tight. The numbers are pretty divided, and that just means that absolutely every single vote counts. So it may be your vote that counts. It may be, as I said before, that last minute text message, or that's something that you posted on social media, or that last minute phone calls that makes it the defining factor. So again, the pandemic is playing out very differently from city to city, from state to state, and that just means that all of us have to pull our weight.
It's so true. And, you know, we already know that because of this pandemic, the election is going to look very different. So everyone needs to have a plan on election day, or, you know, if you're planning to do mail-in voting. So how important, Brianna, is it to have a plan? And are you seeing that people are sort of taking the measures to do that? Or is it still sort of not as, because we know that Latinos are a bit more wary of mail-in voting, but it's a very safe way to vote. And especially amid a pandemic when, you know, if you're elderly, you don't want to be going to the polls. So what are you seeing in terms of that in the Latino community when it comes to preparing to vote?
Yeah, so, you know, this year at Voto Latino, we've seen a huge increase in voter registration. Our goal is 500,000 voters, and as of today, middle of September, we're at 300,000, which is so exciting. And yes, it's a cause for celebration, and at the same time, you know, it really is the first step. There is a lot of missing information, especially in our community, around civic engagement. Some individuals, you know, they're not aware that they have to make plans to go vote or request a ballot or return it by a certain date. And that really is a way that the system is created to push out individuals, to, suppress votes at times. We've seen in states like Texas and North Carolina and Georgia, where their rules make it so challenging for new voters and people who are just barely entering this process to even engage in it and have their voice heard. So for us, that's, definitely a worry. Our team did a poll earlier this year and saw that people were unfamiliar with ballots. Less than half had ever used one, and people are needing information. And I think that's definitely where we can come in as trusted sources of truth to help share that and make sure, yes, you registered. Now, please go vote, make sure it's counted and that you're bringing your whole entire family, whether mailing ballots or showing up on election day.
And either Cynthia or Mariana, whoever wants to answer this one, but what do you think are the most important tools that groups have to reach Latinos and inform them about how to vote, whether it's on election day or mail-in voting? What are the tools that we have in order to facilitate that process?
Well, first of all, big, enormous shout out to Brianna and everybody at Voto Latino. The work
Thank you.
done is incredible. I mean, year after year, but especially this year. I mean, the amount of Latinx voters that they registered after the George Floyd protests, it just goes to show that when you engage your community with things that affect them directly, with messaging that speaks to us, that is authentic, you get the results. I mean, you get the return on your investment. But I think Voto Latino is one of the best tools that we have across the country. That is why I actually joined the Leadership Council of Voto Latino this year. Woo, we haven't officially announced it, but I can hear
Breaking news.
The exclusive, exactly. So I would just go, Voto Latino is a trusted source. I think it is so important now in a time of social media bots and misinformation and fake news. It is so important to have these organizations like a Voto Latino that we trust, like Naleo, for example. I think in my case, when I wanted to register to vote here in Miami, I said, you know what? I'm just gonna go to the good old fashioned website of the Miami-Dade County Elections Office, and that's where I'm gonna get my information from. I downloaded my form, and you can do it online. I wanted to sort of feel the weight of the moment, and I filled it out, and old fashioned, I went and I dropped it off because, again, for me, it's a sacred duty. It's a privilege to be able to do that in this country. So if you want to be triple sure, print things out and just triple check with everyone. There are hotlines that are available. Naleo has a hotline. It is 1-888-VE-VOTA. And then, as I said, the Voto Latino website.
And Brianna, how do we transfer that same energy and zeal that Mariana has for voting to our family members, to our mami, our papi, our tío, our tía, who, is reluctant to vote or just doesn't? My family lives in Arizona and some of them don't vote. And it's just crazy to me because I'm like, your vote counts like no other. And it's so, it's so unfortunate that not everyone feels that duty as an American to go vote, but that's her reality. And I think this year is the year that some of my relatives are finally getting it and are going to be going to vote. But how do we transfer that enthusiasm that first-time voters like Mariana or anyone have to others who maybe feel a little bit less disillusioned by the process or by, our country?
I am so excited when I meet people like Mariana and they are, jumping for joy and ecstatic that they can share their voice and go out and vote and get registered for the first time. And, I want that experience for everyone that we at Voto Latino engage with. And when I think about people in my family who are less excited, I have to take time to backtrack and realize there are some very real reasons that people in our community are not excited to engage civically. people feel disenfranchised. They've experienced racism. They feel like, you know, people running for office, they don't look like me and they care about my family. So why would I even vote? And what we see, you know, our organization is it really is the younger generation getting their moms, getting their tias, getting their primos and primas excited and saying, you know, I know that you're not happy and I'm willing to, you know, take a risk and share that I still believe in this community, and voting is one right, one duty, one way that I have, whether it's a protest as a vote or a way to say I'm in support, but actually showing up to the polls or mailing your ballot and saying, I belong here, this is my voice, and this country is going to hear from me. So I would love to share that with everyone. Please engage your family, let them know that their vote isn't in vain and that their voice is important. That's why we live in this country.
Yeah, our vote is our voice. Cynthia, what would you say are ways that we can engage our family members or friends who are less excited to vote?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Brianna. There are very specific reasons why the previous generation of voters were disillusioned. And one of the primary reasons was voter suppression. And I would just say that one, again, big kudos, big applause to Voto Latino, because I just think what you guys are doing, or what I shouldn't say guys, what you women are doing is really inspiring us to go, wait a second, we've lost the previous generation, we've lost our way. I'm a voter, but I do understand if you see a film called Capturing the Flag, and I encourage people to watch this film, it's called Capturing the Flag by Anne Demare. There's another film that's recently on Netflix that's called All In, and it's by Lisa Cortez and Liz Garbus. What you will see is people of color on an ongoing basis being switched from poll to basically say that you understand what voter suppression is when you see these films, and you will understand what you have to do to fight voter suppression. So to answer your question, I think we need to figure out concrete ways. When you said, what's the main thing? What's the main tool, perhaps? I do think that we need to use radio shows and programs like this, podcasts, to talk to our generation and our community about, wait a second, what are the 5 steps to do if you go to the polls and they say you're no longer eligible to vote? Like, what are the specific things that you have to do? I think radio right now should be very focused on explaining to our voters what are the steps that we need to do to ensure that our votes count. And then thirdly, I do agree that sometimes it takes the passion that I'm seeing from Brianna and Mariana in front of our family members saying, no, okay. There was a young woman who was talking about, I was interviewing her for a recent show that we do called NIWIF Talks. And I said, what do you want people to do? And she said, George Floyd died and he was suffocated for 9 minutes. Please take 9 family members to go and vote. And how many Latinos have been killed in this country? If you think about that, say to yourself, okay, for George Floyd, I could bring 9 in the morning. And what can I do in the afternoon? What can I do in the evening? And so if we have cohorts of women and men who bring, quote unquote, their tribe to vote, help them vote, I think that is the way to go. And in addition, I think we need to spend time with our, I don't want to say our elderly, because they're not always elderly, but with our previous generation, and look at the ballot, because it's very confusing, the ballots. So, I think it's important to say, okay, this is how this works, so that we're tactically informing our own families.
Of course. And you touched on something very interesting in terms of media's role in all of this. When I used to watch TV with my mom, Spanish media, Univision or Telemundo, they were so big about encouraging people to do their civic duty, to vote. You don't see that as much in English media, and obviously that's probably because they have a more targeted audience and they know that our turnout in the past has not been good. So my question to you, Mariana, is what's media's role in term when it comes to this, whether it's, you know, the media, CNN, NBC, or podcast, social media? What is its role when it comes to encouraging people to vote?
It's critical. And I worked as a national correspondent at Univision and at NBC, so I can appreciate, you know, the contrast that exists there. I think Spanish language media understands that they are providing a service to our community. Literally, they are as trusted, if not more, than like the church, even for like immigration advice. Mainstream media or English speaking media tends to overlook us. And it was still unbelievable to me that during my time at MSNBC, I was the only Latino correspondent that existed on a network like MSNBC. I found that just unfathomable when I meet so many young Latinos that are out there wanting to make their voices heard at the local level. I'm like, why are they not here at the national level? So I have made it a goal of mine to open up space and seats at the table for more Latinos to be in news, driving the narrative. What is the role of news? I think the role of traditional outlets is to just cover us. You know, don't just cover the same communities and the same people that all look the same, that all have the same names. You know, sometimes when you're talking about a medical story, the doctor can be a Latino. When you're talking about a story that requires a lawyer, that lawyer can be a Latino. You know, we need to stop showing these same images of, you know, they're coming through the border, they're coming to take their jobs. Latinos are amazing. Latinos like Cynthia with her 11 freaking Emmys sitting there like in her living room, you know? So I think it is up to media to accurately reflect us, to cover us, to send reporters out there to ask us questions. It was something that was very evident to me. I covered 2016 at NBC, and like NBC, many other networks missed the mark because we kept covering the same people and we didn't interview a whole bunch of other people that had things to say and had concerns. And I don't want us to miss the mark this time around. So I think as viewers, we have to hold those networks accountable and say, with our tweets, with our retweets, like, I demand more diversity in terms of the voters that you speak to, in terms of the communities that you go to, and less stereotypes. And then in terms of social media, we are to be held accountable, right? I think that we have to be held accountable by everything we post, we repost. If you see something on Facebook, if you see something on TikTok, on Twitter, like, ask yourself, is this accurate? Who posted this? Where does it come from? What's the intention behind it? What's the motive behind this? Because you can't just say, oh, I just retweeted something, you know, I'm not to be held accountable. No, you are using your platform to make echo of whatever that information is. So make sure that that power is used responsibly. And also, if you like content, if you like reporting, if you like coverage of a certain community, if you want more of that, you have the power with your click to make editors say, wow, did you see how many clicks that story got? Let's cover more of that. But if we don't use that power, then we're going to remain invisible.
Very well said. And Brianna, to sort of go off of what Mariana said, what kind of role is misinformation playing this election season when it comes to whether it's mail voting or just this election in general, and how can we combat it within our Latino communities?
Misinformation is scary because it lurks everywhere. There are, tons of posts on social media that are going to be sharing wrong dates for the election, false information about, mailing in your ballot, how it's not safe. There's also conversation around, Cuban and Venezuelan immigrants who came to the United States and left flawed socialist regimes. And you're going to see a lot of misinformation sharing that, we're seeing the rise of a socialist regime now in the United States, which is not true. We're going to be having a democratic election. And, if anything, capitalism is in America. So those are a few things that are going to be spreading around social media. We also see it, in our communities and with our families. It could be, an aunt or an uncle sharing a fake news story on your family's WhatsApp or your group chat. I know there have been times where I had to police my uncles and ask them, like, where did you hear that story and who reported it? And, do they sound like a credible source? Or, I saw that at work. Did you hear that was a story about fake news? And that is really us, as Mariana mentioned, being accountable and holding others accountable. These are, not fun conversations. Sometimes they can be tough with people you care about. And at the same time, they're so important because this rise of, fake news and misinformation is exactly a challenge that we saw in 2016 with other bad actors engaging and influencing our elections. There's so much spending on social media. A lot of it might be fake news, and it's really incumbent upon us to be thoughtful of how we engage and how we disseminate that information.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Cynthia, Mariana, do you have anything to, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's so critical when we think about misinformation or, facts that are not facts, but that claim to be facts, right? And years ago, the National Association of Latino Journalists did a research piece, and it was devastating to most of us, that they looked at news coverage and saw that basically Latinos were covered 1% of time within a newscast in general. That 1% of its airtime daily was something about Latinos. And then 90% of that 1% was a Latino had killed someone, robbed someone, had done something that was illegal, or was, as I think it was Mariana mentioning, we're crossing a border trying to get someplace. And these images then get perpetuated in the media as the only images of Latino people. And yet a study was done 10 years after that study, and they found again that it wasn't 1%, it was 1.5%, but then it was 99% that was negative. So from my perspective, I think that we do need to demand of our media outlets that there be diversity and inclusion, that there be pay equity for the journalists who work for these networks, that it's just not Latinos get freelance jobs at these networks and don't get permanent positions. I think that we need to really vocalize that our young people want to see how we're contributing to society, and the ways that they depict us contributing to society are not accurate. So I do think there's much work to do in this area.
Yeah, representation really matters. When you see someone on TV that looks like you're more likely to, listen and to think to yourself, oh, I can do that one day. That can be me, whether it's a national correspondent like Mariana or an Emmy Award winning journalist like you, Cynthia. So my next question is sort of along polling that I've seen lately that I think is really interesting, and I'm really curious your take on it. So looking at recent polls, it's really interesting to me that there's very much a gender gap between Hispanic men and women when it comes to who they're leaning toward this election. Latino men seem to be more supportive of Trump, and Latinas overwhelmingly support Biden. What would you guys say is behind this gender gap?
So I know we all took a moment there to think about it, and I was thinking about it relative to my own experience. And really for, Latina women, we see that a lot of the challenges that they face, the Democratic Party has a platform for. So we talked about, pay equity. We know studies show that Latinas make 54 cents to the dollar. We want representation. And we've been able to see that in the Democratic Party, where 2018, we had the most diverse Congress elected with badass Latinas like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it was just amazing to see, someone like her really arguing and fighting for, issues that matter to Latinas, and to be up there front and center and representing our community. And, when we tie it back to, coronavirus, when we were talking earlier, that Latina women have been heavily impacted. They are seeking a change and they want to be heard. And it seems like the Democratic Party, at least has some sort of open platform for them to engage. I've connected with other, Republican operatives who work for, the Republican Party, and they talk about women, and we don't see women leadership like we're starting to see in the Democratic Party. You had Stacey Abrams, you had AOC, like I mentioned, just amazing women who are really moving this movement and having their voices heard. And we don't see that on the other side, which is really unfortunate.
I do think that, a recent Pew study showed that Biden and the Democratic ballot or ticket did get an infusion of Latina women supporters, specifically after the announcement of Kamala Harris. And I think, going back to what Brianna just said, we are looking for, Latina women are looking for leadership on a variety of levels, but we also are looking for representation. And I think that she, as a candidate, represents many of the cultural, the upwardly mobile values that as Latina women we have. And in addition to some of her other stances, obviously, on various issues. And I think it remains to be seen. I have to say, with the crisis that we're currently in, when I think about the Latina women who were elected to Congress, and how many women, at least in my lifetime, this is the first time that I was able to witness that level of infusion of women power, if you will, and diverse women power. So now let's put it into action. How do we support those women who have our backs, if you will? And how do we grow the next generation of leaders who potentially could be the daughters of the women on this panel, to seek government positions? Because I think previous generations, we were always suspects of government positions, if you will, of leadership. And I think there could be a change now if we do see positive change in how government functions.
And Mariana, would you say that this representation does sort of affect the way people view the Democratic Party? If you get this infusion of diverse women that win elections and are now representing, where they're from, in the halls of Congress, what does that do to a person?
It's a lightning rod. It's something that can affect real positive change, because what we were talking about before, when you see yourself in the halls of Congress, when you see somebody that looks like you and sounds like you on television, you say, oh, I can do that. But not only that, when I started out, especially when I crossed over to English speaking media, there was a whole thing about, you get into a network at the national level and people ask, like, how are you going to pronounce your name? Are you going to say, this is Mariana coming to you live? Or, people ask you to cut your hair, or like your eyebrows are too dark and all these things. And then you're like, why am I going to change? What's the point of having me here if a young Latina is going to be looking at the screen and saying like, why'd she change? I want them to say like, she got there and she didn't have to change who she was, so I can be there too and not change to make others feel comfortable around me. And when you see all of these amazing Latinas, like the AOCs of the world, with her red lipstick and her hoops, like even the Sonia Sotomayors of the world, you say like, oh my God, look at them, I can get there too. So that opens up a person's just world. It opens up their mind to the fact that that is a possibility. And you ladies are all spot on. I think that we see that kind of enthusiasm and representation on the Democratic side, and not so much on the Republican side. And also, let's not forget, our community. When I think of somebody like my mom, right? Mi mamá es una brava, o sea, Latina women were the ones putting food on the table. We are the ones that are raising our kids. We're the ones that make our households work. But also we go to work, we put food on the table, and we're expected to look beautiful. Manicures, pedicures, and heels and everything as we do it. So we wear a lot of hats, and we expect no less from our elected officials.
That's so true. And with that, I do want to close it off and also just thank you guys for such a great discussion. I mean, we covered this historic election, the huge role Latinos will have, what it means now that we're amid a pandemic and about to choose our next president and who represents us in the halls of Congress, and what we ended with, representation matters, whether it's who you see on TV or who is representing you in Congress, it matters. So thank you guys so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Yahaira, Cynthia, Brianna. I'm in awe of the both of you, and let's stick together, because that's the final note of what we need, is just to stick together and to unite as a community, and we're going to be unstoppable.
Thank you, everyone. We've got this. All the power is here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I will be back in touch. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. To hear about more topics that are important to Latinxes, make sure to catch Brianna and other Latinx talent on the new HBO special Habla Now, streaming now on HBO and HBO Max. Join us for our next 2 episodes, a 2-part discussion which will cover race and colorism in the Latinx community, as well as the impact of Black Lives Matter on the Latinx community.